welcome to another edition of the Film Library at Kanopy podcast. I'm Daniel Thompson, your host, along with my co-host, Alonso Duralde. Alonso, how you doing, sir?
Excellent. And, you know, I have to say, we always talk about how, you know, Kanopy is there for you with just a library card. You know what else you can get with a library card, Daniel?
Books.
Books.
What? Books.
I know.
Unbelievable.
Actually, I'll tell you, your library card gets you so much stuff.
Yeah.
Like, go ask. You would be amazed. Like, parking passes to your local state park. Like, just,
I didn't know that.
Yeah.
I didn't know that
you
one.
You know, you could DVDs and CDs, all kinds of things that your library will check out.
I did know about the books. I did know about the books.
The books, yeah, kind of near the top of the list. But you know what? Some of the greatest films ever made are adaptations of books. And, you know, it doesn't always work necessarily, but very often.
Sometimes it doesn't work at all. And
yes.
This is one of these arguments you get in with big book people.
Sure.
Like, I think sometimes book people want to create a war with the big movie people on, like, is the book better or is the movie better? And I think when it works well, it's a marriage. It's symbiotic. You know?
Can't we all get along, book and movie people? You know,
yeah, exactly.
You know, very often I will get asked when I'm reviewing a movie, like, "Oh, well, did you read the book first?" And I try to let the movie just be the movie.
Correct.
You know, and come into it, you know, because I figure most people who see this film will not have read the book first, and so they'll want a fresh perspective on just how the film works by itself. But it is always fascinating, I think, if you have read the book, to look at the movie, to kind of just explore how they might work differently in terms of telling their story, and also what choices do the filmmakers have to make about what to keep and what to get rid of. You know, I think one of the most faithful book adaptations I've ever seen was Todd Haynes' Mildred Pierce, and that was like 8 hours long.
Yeah,
because, you know, books can fit in so much incident and character and inner monologue and all that thing. But, you know, the best movies capture at least the sense of what a book is about, the sense of the mood and the tone and all of that good stuff that you get on the page, and they bring it to the screen.
Yeah, I growing up, I never liked to read fiction. So, like, I love reading history, big nonfiction reader, never liked to read fiction. So the movies were my way into stories.
Gotcha.
And so then hearing that, like, I should read these books first was an offense to me initially. It was like, what do you mean read it? Why? Like,
But there's a movie.
Yeah. But come to find out, there's some movies you 100% needed, but I do like the idea of experiencing the films on their own. I can remember my mom and dad going to a showing of Howard's End, Anthony Hopkins, which is on Kanopy, and they would come back and they just raved about the movie. And I, at that point as a kid, I remember going, I want to watch Howard's End. Now, I never knew it was a book, never knew it was a book. And so growing up, I watched a lot of movies. I had no idea that they originated as books. And I think the beauty of the film adaptation of that is that sometimes writers are writers for a reason. They know how it looks in their head, but getting to make that make sense on screen is a whole different ballgame. And so you see those marriages where authors and directors or filmmakers or writers have the ability to create something unique that has the spirit of it without necessarily being the 8-hour slog, although Todd Haynes is amazing, like the 8-hour film version that has every single thing in it. And I think the best movies from books are not the ones that honor all the little details that the readers are looking for.
No, absolutely. There's a real art to adaptation. There's a real sort of, you know, the skill in deciding what to keep, what to get rid of, what to change entirely. Am I just going to focus on a section of the book?
That's right.
You know, like say Wuthering Heights. I was shocked to learn when I read it in high school that there's a whole other part of the book after the events of the movie with Laurence Olivier and Merle Oberon. So, you know, very often, even if you enjoyed the movie and feel like that's already given you the book, you know, the book may have all kinds of new treasures for you to explore. And similarly, if you love the book, you may find that the movie maybe like changes some things around, or even just gives you visually, gives you, you know, in the soundtrack, in the performance, in all of the different things that cinema can accomplish, a deeper understanding, a deeper thrill of that same story.
Yeah, and we talked about it a little bit with world cinema, but I think book-to-screen adaptations are also a nice little on-ramp to empathy, because when you read a book, you're making up all those voices in your head. That's what I do, at least. Every character has their own voice.
Sure.
So everything. And so when you're watching someone's interpretation of that, and it's not your interpretation, now you get to reckon with, oh, maybe these characters' motivations are different, or maybe I can see why this character I didn't like in the book I liked on film, or vice versa. I think it allows you the opportunity to experience something that's outside of your control. And so when it works well, and when it doesn't work well, different story. But when it works well, I think it can really be magic. And I got to tell you, of all the guests that we've had on the Film Library, they've all been wonderful. I cannot think of anyone more uniquely qualified to talk to us about book to screen adaptations than our guest this week. You want to tell us a little bit more about who that is?
Sure. Kristen Lopez is film editor at The Wrap, but more importantly for our purposes today, she is the author of But Have You Read the Book? A 52 classic book-to-film adaptations where she digs deep in both the movie and the book versions, talk about what works in each, maybe what doesn't, and the process of how those books are turned into some of the most beloved films of all time.
Essential reading for those of you that love books and love movies made from books. We're going to dive into that interview now. I think you're going to really enjoy it. Here's the Film Library trivia question for today. This 1993 adaptation of a Shakespeare comedy features Denzel Washington, Emma Thompson, and Keanu Reeves among its star-studded cast. Think you know the answer? Find out after the interview. Welcome back to the Film Library, a Kanopy podcast. Alonso, page-to-screen adaptations. That's what we're talking about today.
We are.
And we've got a great guest who literally wrote the book on it.
Literally, yes. She knows about turning books into movies and did the book on it herself. The film editor at The Wrap, Kristen Lopez, is here with us today. Welcome, Kristen.
Thank you so much for having me. It's always funny when people say, you literally wrote the book on it. And I'm like, I feel like that implies I'm an expert. I just read way too much.
That was going to be my first question.
That gives you a head start over a lot of folks.
Yeah. Which is to write a book about page-to-screen adaptations and the book coming before the movie. Do you have to be a bigger book fan or movie fan? And it sounds like book fan is what I'm hearing.
I think you have to be both. You have to love one medium or another. You know, when I got pitched the concept of doing this book, what I thought was funny, and I tell the story all the time, is that they said, well, you have a master's in English. Do you read a lot? Which I had to laugh because A, this was the first time in the X amount of years since I got my master's that anybody had ever cited it as a benefit. And B, like, yes, most people that know if you have a master's in English, odds are you are required to read an exorbitant amount. And I do, but at the same time, you know, I'm just a person that is impatient, you know, so for me, I was reading adaptations before I wrote this book because I'm one of those that, like, if a movie got greenlit with somebody that I loved in it, I can't wait the year or 2 years or however long it takes for the movie to come out. I need to know what to be excited about. So I would just go and read the book ahead of time. And then I'd feel like superior to everybody. Like, I read the book. I already know what happens. And then inevitably go see the movie and realize they took out like all the parts that I loved or all the elements. And so then I got another level of superiority, which is like, if you read the book, the movie would have been way better. So yeah, I think it just comes from like wanting to be a fan of some type of storytelling, you know, whether that is film or literature. You know, at this point, they literally go hand in hand.
Absolutely. So now you went through 52 different book to screen adaptations in But Have You Read the Book? And I'm wondering if just in that limited sample, there were any kind of trends that stood out to you in terms of what gets cut or how things get squoze, you know, to fit from one medium into another.
I think it's fascinating because it's easier to find trends in the past, mostly because there is so much content nowadays, and there are so many books that get immediately greenlit for a film or a TV series that it's often hard for people to realize stuff is adapted at this point than maybe they were 15, 20 years ago. But, you know, in the studio days, one of the biggest things that always tended to be cut, you know, you saw the studio influence a lot more clearly. So, you know, in the 1950s, you know, political elements were usually more overt, you know, like Jack Finney's Body Snatchers is now considered a example of like communism or consumerism or a lot of the things that the 50s identified with. And really the book is more about kind of the death of small town America and how we have less connection to our elders, which is not really a compelling storytelling device. So they make it more like about, you know, different things, which the screenwriters would tell you they didn't make it about anything. They just made it, you know, what it is. But politics and religion always tend to be the things that get cut. You know, one of the things that I was always fascinated reading Rosemary's Baby for the first time is just how much that book is about Catholicism and religion. And the film is not, because they didn't want to offend anybody. So that tends to be a bit more overt. Nowadays, it's ways to really emphasize, to get the audience that doesn't know it's based on a book in.
Sure.
You know, so it's about simplifying the story, making it more 4 quadrant. So it's less about content and more about getting the most audience that you can get for your film.
So you're writing this book and you narrowed it down to 52 films from books, correct? What was the criteria? I mean, you're dealing with just myriad titles here. What was the criteria to narrow it down to these 52 that you decided were going to make the book?
It was a really collaborative process with TCM. You know, I initially sent them a lot of stuff and stopped it at 95. And they were like, Kristen, we may be a classic film company, but, you know, you need to have a breadth of history. Adaptations didn't stop after Jurassic Park, which I was like, fine. You know, Warner's had one stipulation. They really wanted me to include Dune because it was coming out around the time the book was going to come out, which I was hesitant about because I didn't care about the book or the movie. But, you know, I learned some stuff.
And that's a long book.
I thankfully only had to read half. So thank you, Denis Villeneuve, for only doing half the film.
But you learned all about spice trade, I'm sure.
Yes. But for me, it was really just a back and forth process. You know, the movies had to be accessible to an audience. They had to be in print. The books had to be accessible. So they had to be in print. So there were a couple of books that were really hard to find, you know, that I couldn't include, or books that, you know, maybe hadn't been translated to English that I needed to find. And then after that, it became, you know, kind of what's popular. So there were a couple of books on the list that, you know, they would send me notes and they'd be like, Kristen, you have so many Dennis Lehane books on here. You need to cut some of them. Or, you know, Kristen, no one's seen this movie. No one's heard of this book. Can you maybe find some things a bit more popular? So it had to be in its own way enough to get audiences who maybe had never read these books or never seen these movies to want to be interested in that. So it was a real back and forth. And then eventually 52 was just like a number that I was like, I think I can do that. Everybody asked me if it's because I picked one for every week in the year, and I am not that smart at all. It was just like 52 sounds doable. And that's where I ended.
It's for the eventual deck of playing cards version of the book.
Yes.
Right, right, exactly, yes.
So yeah, you this was for TCM's publishing arm, and so obviously with, you know, classic movies versus more contemporary ones, do you find was the existence of the production code in the 30s through the mid 60s like a real decisive thing in terms of like, well, we have to leave out this adulterous subplot or this, you know, interracial marriage or whatever it was that like studios just wouldn't allow at the time?
You definitely notice that. You know, The Thin Man is a great example. The Dashiell Hammett version of The Thin Man is very dark. You know, the family that Nick and Nora are investigating are doing drugs, and there's an adulterous affair. The one brother's like ridiculously interested in murder and is like a creeper that keeps asking Nick Charles to like talk about murder and cannibalism and stuff. But what I also noticed too, and The Thin Man is a great example, is the way that certain things were anglicized as well, you know, to emphasize the American film market. So, you know, in The Thin Man, he's not Nick Charles, he's Nick Chalembrides. I think that I'm pronouncing that right. He's Greek. He's a Greek immigrant.
Huh.
And so what's fascinating is that part of his relationship with Nora isn't just the fact that he is a working man who does not come from money, but he's literally not American, and he's integrating himself with this waspy family. And of course, that's not how 1930s Hollywood would have done it. They cast Bill Powell. And I love the movie, but the book, I think, makes, an interesting point about, ethnicity and relationship to America. Then you have something like Anita Luz's Gentlemen Prefer Blondes, where the book is really openly mocking people in the industry at the time, So there's a great subplot, if you've seen the Howard Hawks version, where, Henry Spofford III is this little boy that is so adorable and so charming in the film. Well, in the book, he is a grown man who is modeled after Will Hayes. And ends up marrying Lorelei Lee so that she can make these movies, and kind of like, it's this really interesting little satire, but they're based on real people that were actually working in entertainment at the time. So there's this real meta turn to them. It's usually easy to see why stuff gets cut in the way that it does. But it's always, I think it's the one element that I always recommend about reading books based on classic films, because they are just infinitely wilder than the film version could ever be.
Was there anything in your research or in the book, in working towards reading and watching for the book, that changed your mind, or a preconceived notion you had about a book or a film, or the difference between the two, or the qualitative difference between the two?
Yeah, I had never read The Shining before. I had grown up on the movie, but I had never read the King novel. And all I had known was that King hated the Kubrick version of the film, and that he had tried, made his own and all of that. And then reading the book, I was so fascinated by not just how different it was to the Kubrick version, but that Kubrick is really making a horror film. And King is writing this really interesting, traumatizing look at alcoholism and addiction and the generational trauma that it imparts on families. And my cat is photobombing me right now. And I really love that. I love the film, but it made the book made the film more interesting to me as a result. Another one I always throw out is Talented Mr. Ripley. I love the movie. The movie was like a foundational film for me in a lot of ways, like how it objectifies men and all these different things. But I had never read Highsmith's novel, and I knew about Highsmith as a person, but I didn't really know the book. And when I started reading it, I was really interested in how directors put in subtext that maybe isn't always in the source material. So like the book, Highsmith isn't really saying that Ripley is gay or straight. You can read it as an attack on consumerism and wealth and, privilege and all these different things. But the element of making Tom Ripley gay, it was all Minghella, and so that made me look at that film differently of like, what does that say about Minghella that he wanted to add this element to it? So if anything, it made me look at how screenwriters take material and why they do what they do. They have a really hard job, but at the same time, the elements they bring to it really can set the tone for how people maybe approach the source material later.
Well, sure. Yeah. The same novel can produce all different kinds of films. Purple Noon, which is the French adaptation of Ripley, is completely different from Talented Mr. Ripley, which is completely different from The American Friend, or like Buñuel's Wuthering Heights versus, William Wyler's or whatever. So you not only are you getting the page to screen, but just sort of different people starting at the same place and then shooting off into whatever directions they're going. So Kanopy has an entire section that they call From Page to Screen. And so as, we're calling you an expert whether you want it or not, having kind of thumbed through that section, what are some that leap out to you as like, oh, these are some must-sees and that do an interesting job of taking that novel and turning it into something fascinating on the screen?
It was hard for me to pick just a couple because there were a lot of different options for me. If we're talking about stuff that's in the book, I love that there's Infamous and Capote. I have In Cold Blood in the book, and I had never read or seen In Cold Blood.
Oh, wow.
And for me, I knew more about Capote than I knew about the novel that he wrote. And I think those are, even though they're telling more of the story of him writing In Cold Blood, they're both really great examples of showing how a writer writes and also how a writer can kind of make their notoriety off of trauma and,
other people
tragedy.
suffering.
Exactly. Which, having read In Cold Blood, a lot of the after effects of that were the townsfolk of that town saying that, they felt that Truman Capote exploited them, that he played up a lot of things for dramatic effect that weren't true. So, if you're a fan of like the true crime model and how it both is interesting and exploitative, they're really interesting movies. And I love that Lolita is on. I almost put Lolita on in the book, but Lolita is always a difficult book to talk about and a film to talk about, because you have to figure out which version you want to discuss. I probably disclosing far too much, but I watched the 97 version at a very young age. Probably shouldn't have. Became a very big Jeremy Irons fan after that. And it's really interesting watching both versions of Lolita, the Kubrick and the Adrian Lyne, because both of them take the book in different directions. The book is very hard to adapt. It's very satirical, very, some people call it scummy. Some people call it a work of art. There's a lot of like backstory to it, and it's difficult to discuss. But I feel like watching the films at this point yields a lot of good conversation, that I appreciate. And then, Great Gatsby, we all learn it in school. And I've seen as many versions as I think there are available. I haven't seen the Alan Ladd version, which I know is hard to find. Right. But I go very strongly for the Robert Redford version, which is on Kanopy. I saw the Baz Luhrmann one. It's fun. It's got a lot of whiz bang. And
it's a Baz Luhrmann film.
It's a Baz Luhrmann film. But I never understand the hate for the Redford version. I don't get it. I think it's a pretty faithful adaptation of the book in a lot of ways. And Robert Redford's just like the perfect Gatsby for the 1970s.
No question. And I think, again, when people get mad at those movies, it's very often because everybody reads a book differently, and everybody visualizes the characters' faces and what they're going to sound like and all that stuff in a different way. And so very often I think there's this notion of like, well, you didn't film my Gone with the Wind or my Twilight or my whatever, and so I'm going to get mad at it. And so, are there moments where you find yourself having to sort of take a step back and reevaluate a movie from, obviously there's no such thing as an objective standpoint, but at least one that's less colored by your own experience of having read the book?
I tend to be, I think because I'm in the industry, so to speak, I think I look at it like I understand more why changes are made in certain elements, and then there are other moments where I just get really like frustrated that things are the way they are. To throw another Kanopy title out there, I love Roald Dahl books. I put Charlie and the Chocolate Factory in the book, but I love The Witches, and I did not grow up with the book in that way. I saw the movie first. And, for me, I always think children's books are really interesting to adapt because you have to really cater to the most nitpicky audience, which is kids. And I think that, it's fascinating to look at some of those books that I grew up with and having that relationship or not having it. I can still look at a movie and be as objective as I can, unless it fundamentally alters something about what makes the text great, and then I start to get really irritated, where I'm just like, but the character is so strong, and now this change makes them weak. Like, I'm usually pretty forgiving as long as it does not fundamentally alter what makes the book great. Which a lot of adaptation screenwriters will say they try to at least attempt.
Sure. Yeah. Is there a book that is beloved by you that you believe the film is qualitatively as good, if not better, than the book?
Ooh, that is so tough. I always say the go-to for me is Jurassic Park. I understand why Crichton was the most adapted, next to like Ira Levin, one of the most adapted authors. And, for Jurassic Park is a perfect movie. And the book, I also would say, is a perfect book, even though they are very different. You know, the book version of Jurassic Park starts as like a mystery film, you know, with a bunch of animal attacks, and you have different characters on this island trying to figure out what is happening, which if you've seen The Lost World, which is the second film, it opens with the opening of the book. You know, and at the same time, they're both equally compelling. You know, Crichton was a very cinematic writer, you know, so you get a lot of fast pace, you get a lot of characters you come to love. You know, he uses a lot of photos of, like, you know, computer screens and stuff. So it's almost like you're watching a movie unfold in front of you. And you lose nothing by reading the book or seeing the movie. At this point, most people have seen the movie than have ever read the book, you know, but I always tell people to read the book because it's a whole new way in, and it's just as fun. You know, if you've ever wanted to see John Hammond be the villain, well, the book's got that for you. Or if you wanted to see this character live, they probably lived in the book and they died on screen. They're two halves of a already amazing world. And that doesn't always happen. But yeah, Jurassic Park is one where I'm just like, they're equally great. I cannot choose.
Yeah, I mean, Crichton had already been a filmmaker at that point, so I think a lot of his novels, in the back of his mind at least, it was like, this is an outline for a screenplay that I or someone else will be writing at some point, you know. Do you have a wish list title of a novel that hasn't been adapted yet that you think that they're leaving money on the table?
Oh, gosh. I mean, I again, bringing it back to Dennis Lehane, you know, Dennis Lehane, they've only adapted one of his Kenzie Gennaro books, which was Gone Baby Gone, which I think is good. But there's another book that he wrote that's, I think, the second book in the series that is just so dark and so fantastic. And I'm just like, how is this not? I know they were contemplating a TV show for a little bit, but I'm just like, I need this to happen as quickly as possible. You know, Matt Ruff, who wrote the book that became Lovecraft Country, has a lot of really great, just weird books that are probably unfilmable because he loves to, like, create, like, metaverses. And, you know, there's one book that he wrote that's all set in a character's head, you know, so how do you pull that off? You know, but they're so entertaining and they're so fun to read. And then Max Allan Collins, he's a favorite author of mine. He did Road to Perdition, but he has a whole series of detective stories with a character of his that is kind of like Forrest Gump, that goes through different, like, crimes and is involved in them. Then I'm, again, still kind of surprised that nobody has attempted to adapt. But they're all great, and they should be made as quickly as possible because I would be the first person to buy a ticket.
The book is, but have you read the book? 52 literary gems that inspired our favorite films. The author is Kristen Lopez. Kristen, thank you so much for giving us your time in this wonderful book and shining some insights into the world of page-to-screen adaptations. We really appreciate you.
Thanks.
Thank you so much.
It's time to find out the answer to today's Film Library trivia question. If you guessed the 1993 film Much Ado About Nothing, you were correct. Welcome back to the Film Library Kanopy podcast. That was a fun conversation with Kristen Lopez.
Yes, she knows her stuff.
She knows her stuff. It's a fascinating topic, ones where the opinions have to be so varied, from book lovers to film lovers and all in between. And I learned a lot of new stuff there, and some movies that I want to check out, or maybe even, heaven forbid, read a fiction book.
Oh, well, you know, dare to be great, man. I mean, look, you've got your library card to get to Kanopy anyway.
That's
Why
right.
not pick up an actual book too?
Actual book at the actual library.
Go crazy.
Go crazy. That's exactly right.
Yeah, so they've got just an incredible array of stuff. Obviously, you know, we talked about I mentioned the William Wyler Wuthering Heights, which is, you know, one of the all-time greats. Again, it's just the first part of the book, but good enough. That one is there. A lot of great Merchant Ivory, tackling the novels of E.M. Forster, both the Academy Award-winning Howard's End and also the queer romance Morris, which are both just like, Merchant Ivory, people kind of think of, oh yeah, that's the movie where like everybody's wearing tweed and drinking tea, and that's true. But there's a lot more going on, and both of those films I think are really emotionally rich and some great performances. So if you've never seen those, you want to check them out for sure. When Kristen was talking about movies that people don't necessarily know are adaptations, I was surprised in going through the list. Jesus' Son, an acclaimed drama starring Billy Crudup, who's now on Apple TV's The Morning Show. I remember like seeing that film when it came out and loving it and the praise for it. And somehow the fact that it's based on a novel kind of fell to the wayside. Also, the New Zealand classic Once Were Warriors, which was one of the highest grossing films to come out in New Zealand when it opened. It's still considered to be like one of that country's sort of great films, and a lot of people involved with that film have gone on to do a lot of work in the States. Tamara Morrison, from the Star Wars films and Aquaman and a lot of other stuff. Rena Owen, also in the Star Wars films, and one of our great actresses. So there is the stealth adaptation, I guess we can call them.
That's right, and
you don't walk in knowing that's the deal.
See, seemingly limitless possibilities there with a lot of these that you may not even know were screen to film adaptations. She mentioned Infamous and Capote.
Yes.
Two films that take a very different path in showing you Truman Capote as he's writing In Cold Blood. True crime's really big right now. That is kind of something that is part of the cultural zeitgeist.
And yeah, you could make the case that In Cold Blood is really where that starts.
Yes, for sure. So those are really cool to check out if you want to juxtapose two films that kind of, sort of, at least come from one adaptation. But you've got a lot of good options.
Yes. If you recently saw the Tom Hanks film A Man Called Otto, it's an adaptation, and it's a remake of a film called A Man Called Ova, which you can watch here on Kanopy.
Oh, wow. I had no idea. I learned something new on this podcast. Can you believe it? It's unbelievable.
That's why we're here, Daniel.
Long story short, you need to get yourself a library card, get yourself a Kanopy subscription. You need to follow Kanopy on the socials at Kanopy. You need to go to Kanopy.com to get started. This is the best video streamer you can possibly think of for quality, thoughtful entertainment. Whether it's world cinema or horror or LGBTQ or book to screen, as we talked about with Kristen Lopez today. Lots to find at Kanopy, lots to discover, lots to explore, and we're excited to keep bringing you some insight.
Yeah, whatever your flavor of movie is, they've got it for no subscription fees and no ads whatsoever. So until we meet again, go watch something.